Hello, and welcome to Chapter 7 of Introduction to Psychology. Again, today we're going to be studying memory. So, memory is one of the coolest things ever. When I start talking about knowledge, for example, all knowledge is a series of memories. So, since you guys were babies, your brain has been organizing your memories into schemas, basically memory banks, okay? All those memories compound into knowledge. So, for example, when you're a baby, the way you learn your mother's voice, for example, is that you hear your mother's voice, you hear it again, you hear it again, and all these memories of hearing your mother's voice then get encoded into a schema, and then we entitle it mom's voice. So again, your mother's voice, the memory of it, your knowledge of your mother's voice is really just a series of memories. So when you think about knowledge in general, really all it is that you have a series of memories. You've studied facts, you have witnessed events in your life, you've had these experiences, and then you have encoded these memories. So all your knowledge really is just a series of memories, which is a really cool concept, okay? So let's get into memory a little bit. Okay, so the definition of memory is simply the retention of information, okay? Memory includes skills, facts, experiences. So again, all of these memories compound and that becomes the information your brain is working on, your knowledge, okay? So there's several ways to test memories that your book goes over, and this is a discussion question for the week. You have recall. For example, I ask you a question and you have to recall the answer to the question. You have cued recall, which is where I give you a hint. Recognition, where I give you several options and you have to choose from. Savings, where you have to relearn something and then you learn it once, learn it a little bit later, okay? And you just kind of retain a little bit of that information over time. And then implicit memory, where you are asked to generate words without necessarily regarding them as memories. For example, you hear the story Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, and then later you ask to fill in these blanks to answer the names of who the people are. So that's implicit memory. Okay. The book talks about the difference between procedural memories and declarative memories. So procedural memories are how to do something, just physical actions, memories of muscle movements, things along those lines. And declarative memories, these are the ones that we can state in words, okay? Figure 7.4 talks about the information processing model of memory. And again, information processing is taking short-term memories and then transferring those into long-term memories that are attached to memory cues so that you can then retrieve them, okay? And the memory cues can be locations, places, people, little mnemonic devices. We have all kinds of little things we can use for memory cues to be able to recall information, okay? So that's the goal of memory, is to learn information, internalize information, and then find a way to store that information for later use, okay? So short-term memory and long-term memory, okay? So again, your memories go first into short-term memory and then are transferred into long-term memory if you or your brain decides that it should be stored long-term. Again, we don't store all the information we learn in a day. Okay, this is where the executive functioning comes in to determine which types of memories we want to memorize. But short-term memory is temporary storage of events. Long-term memory is a permanent storage of events, okay? The book then breaks long-term memory into two types of memory. You have semantic and episodic. Semantic memory is facts. Episodic memories are your experiences, the events in your life, okay? And then the book also talks about source amnesia. And this is the idea that a lot of you have picked up a lot of information. You honestly don't know where you picked it up. Like, I'm from Chicago. Growing up in Chicago, you know all the music, all the bands that are coming out. I don't know how I know that information. I always say it's through osmosis, but really just living in Chicago, you get exposed to a lot of things and you pick up on stuff, and I might not necessarily where I found out about it. Okay? So when it comes to the capacity of short and long-term memory, okay, your short-term memory has a less capacity than your long-term memory, okay? If you want to improve your short-term capacity, your ability to remember more things in a short term, you have this idea of chunking, which is the idea of grouping numbers together. So for example, if you want to memorize the numbers on your credit card, don't try memorizing all 16 numbers at once. Take the numbers in twos or threes, or maybe a group of four. So that's the idea of chunking, is breaking down your 16-digit credit card number into 3 or 4 numbers that are more easily to remember in a sequence, okay? So memories do decay over time. For example, if you guys learn a bunch of information really fast, and then all of a sudden a week later, you tend to forget that information. And you're like, where'd that information go? Well, it's because that short-term memories weren't processed into long-term memories. For example, maybe you had a quiz, but it's something that's not very relevant to you. So you memorize all the information for the quiz, and the second you took that quiz, then your executive function weeded out those short-term memories, and now you no longer have that information. However, if it's information you need to have over time, again, this is where the idea is of taking our short-term memories and turning it into long-term memories, especially for anyone going into nursing, for example. So if you guys are going to nursing, the anatomy, some of the pharmaceuticals, all those information you guys need to know for nursing is very important to have in your long-term memory. So you need to be able to transfer that from short-term memory to long-term memory. And you can do that by developing associations, applying meaning to it, applying emotion to it. There's a bunch of techniques that we're going to talk about for that. But again, the idea is that memories decay over time, okay? That's why it's very important for the information that you want stored permanently to transfer that into long-term memories. Okay. So working memory, the way I think about working memory is like, for example, if I'm a server in a restaurant, and let's say I'm not writing down people's orders, I'm just trying to memorize all the information. Okay. So my working memory, I might go up and take one, two, three tables. I memorize everybody's orders. I keep that information in my mind until they've left. And then once they've left, then I slowly get rid of that information. Okay. So that's the idea of working memory. Consolidation is an awesome term. This is the idea of converting a short-term memory into a long-term memory. So for example, if I had a guest at my restaurant and I really want to know their name so that every time they came in, I would memorize it. I would then need to consolidate that information about their name, attach some memory cues, and then convert that into long-term memory so that every time they come in, I'll know who they are and then I can develop a rapport with them. So again, it's up to your executive functioning though that tends to govern the shifts of attention to determine what memories get stored into long-term information, okay? Okay. So factors that influence your encoding, the encoding of short-term memories into long-term memories, okay? First and foremost, you have this idea of the primacy effect. So for example, if you were going to memorize an entire list, right, and you wanted to take that information from short-term to long-term, most likely you're going to remember the first few words on the list, and you're also going to remember the last few words on the list, and then you might get jumbled up with the information in between. Okay, so again, the primacy effect is the idea that you tend to remember well the first items in a list, and a recency effect is that you tend to remember the final items in the list. And again, this could just be how you would address memory. You know, so when you go to start memorizing, at first you're like, all right, I'm gonna memorize these first few. Then you kind of get in the middle and you get a little bit sluggish. Then you get to near the end, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm gonna memorize this again. But somewhere in between, you kind of forgot to memorize the stuff in between, you know? So you remember the first part of the chapter really well, and you might remember the last part of the chapter well, but then it's a little bit fuzzy as to what's in the middle of the chapter, okay? So those are some of the factors that influence the encoding of information. Encoding specificity. So retrieval cues, again, are these reminders, okay? So the encoding specificities principle is the idea that the associations you form at the time of learning will be the most effective retrieval cues later. So for me, so many of my memories and my retrieval cues are based upon location. So if I want to remember what happened and when, I try to remember where I was. And once I can remember where I was, then that is my key to accessing my memory. So location's a really big factor for me. Emotions, how'd you felt? Maybe you were at a concert and it was like the greatest concert you were ever at. All you have to do is just think about that emotion of being at that concert and everything sweeps back to you, right? Or maybe when you think about your children when you're young and you think about some moment when you had your 2-year-old and you guys were running and something was really great and you had this great emotion of like, yeah, I'm with my kid. This is awesome. And so then my memory is based upon that moment, that location, where we were, you know? That's the idea of retrieval cues. How to organize your studying. So again, studying all at once doesn't really work very well. So if you're going to cram for an exam, that's not the best way. One of the best ways is to do a little bit of variations. Read the chapter, study a couple weeks ahead, then go back to it a week later, look through it one more time, then come back the next week, kind of test yourself, you know, ask yourself questions, find out if you have it memorized, okay? And so again, it's a process of studying because again, your short-term memory can only transfer so much information in a long-term memory. You have to build up all these memory cues. You have to have some sort of attachment to it. Um, so again, if you want to study, the idea is that you should spread it out because your brain can only really take so much information in at once and then convert that into long-term memory. Okay. So it's good to mix it up. For example, note taking has its advantages and disadvantages. If you're taking really long notes, you might not be encoding that into your brain and trying to remember it as you go. But then if you don't take enough notes, then you might not have enough information to be able to retrieve back those memories. So like for example, in note taking, it's best to write a few words, listen, write a few more words, listen, then try to conceptualize what they were saying, and just do an entire process like that. It tends to work a little bit better. Mnemonic devices also help. Again, this is like if you're trying to learn staffs in music, every good boy does fine, and that tells you what the lines of the music work for. So all of us have these little memory cues to remind us of, for the other one is face, F-A-C-E for the spaces, so we all have these mnemonic devices that are really helpful, okay? So a mnemonic device is any memory aid. So anything you can use to aid your memory. If you can find a way to associate someone's name with something else, or find a way to associate their name with their face, or any of the many ways that we can have memory aids, that's a better way to memorize stuff, okay? So again, the idea of storage goes back to consolidation, and this is the idea, again, of taking your short-term memories and turning them into long-term memories, okay? Some memories do get lost, and then some memories are there and they tend to strengthen over time. And again, depending upon the intensity of the memory, the emotional attachments that you have, the retrieval cues, how strong the moment was when you had that memory tends to depend on whether or not you can retrieve the memories that are stored in your long-term memory, okay? So again, back to retrieval, memory differs from a recording in many ways. For again, you don't just remember, an exact sequence of events. So again, if you think back, you kind of have a general idea about what happened, but you might not know every single thing, okay? So there is this idea of hyperamnesia, and this is the idea of gaining memory over time, and the opposite of that is amnesia, which is the loss of memory, okay? So again, focusing on just one aspect of a memory weakens other aspects. So this is the idea that if you're only focused on one thing in an event, it's all you really remember. You might not remember everything else that's going around you unless you were to encapsulate the entire scene into your memory, okay? So again, the idea is few memories are recalled intact. And then most of us tend to do this process called reconstruction, which is when you try to remember an event, you kind of use your logic and you take some of the memories that you have and you try to put those memories back together to form a story. Because again, all your knowledge is just a series of memories, and then it's up to you to organize those memories to create a scene, just like watching a movie, right? A movie is just a bunch of scenes, and the goal of your memory is to be able to remember those scenes and put it all back together again. And if you were to take a movie, remember the movie, and try to put all the scenes back together, most likely you'd be slightly out of order. Things would be kind of inaccurate. You think someone said something, but they didn't actually say that. That's the idea of reconstruction. We don't have perfect memories, but we generally have a series of memories that we can put together to create a story to recall what happened in the past. That's this idea of reconstructing stories, okay? So a lot of the memories have faded, so it's up to us to kind of put those details back together to see that it makes sense, okay? So hindsight bias, again, is this tendency to mold our recollection of the past to fit how events later turned out. So like if you try to remember something when you were a little kid, your memory of that might be very, very different because you're trying to put it into a context. You're trying to make a story out of your recent knowledge compared to the knowledge that you had back then, for example. So again, some retrieval and interference processes. So retrieval, again, is often based upon memory cues, and then a lot of things can interfere with this ability to make memory cues. So you have proactive interference. This is when the procedure in which old materials increase forgetting of new materials. For example, if you have a bunch of old information, but you just don't have enough room to fit any more information in because you've just learned too much lately, as proactive interference. And this idea of retro interference is a procedure in which new materials increase forgetting of old materials. So for example, maybe I'm taking in a bunch of new memories, and to make room for that, then my brain is going through and cutting out old memories in order to update them with the new memories, okay? So a controversy, recovered memories or false memories. So again, your brain is again capable of putting these stories together based upon a series of memories. So you can have these things that are false memories. For example, the book talks about what happens when you are cute and you're asked about an experience in first grade, and someone's like, "Hey, do you remember when you were here at this exact time in first grade?" And people are like, "Oh, yeah," but they actually never were there. It's because it makes sense that they might have been there, and so they've kind of put some memories together to have a remembrance of being there, but it turns out they were never there at all. So we're all impressionable on this idea of false memories, for example. Okay, so that's really interesting. So, memory for traumatic events, influence of suggestion. A little bit in psychology, you start to deal with these idea of repression. So, for example, when you have really strong memories that are maybe traumatic or very negative, we have this idea of we are repressing our memories from our conscious mind, from our ability to retrieve these memories down into our subconscious mind, our unconscious, because we are unable to process that information, maybe because it was too traumatic, for example, especially in situations like abuse, for example, you might find this. And then you have dissociation. This is a memory that you stored, but you cannot retrieve it. Maybe because of a traumatic event. Again, your brain has disassociated you from that memory cue. So you're no longer able to access that memory because maybe it was too painful. And then again, a false memory is an inaccurate report that someone believes to be a memory. Hence the example that we gave about, hey, remember when you were in first grade and this happened and it never actually happened. So amnesia after damage to the hippocampus, your brain starts to get into the physical traumas of the brain and what can actually happen. So, for example, if you have damage to the hippocampus, you can experience this idea of loss of memory. And the book talks about the example of the person who had a really bad seizures, and so they removed a section of the hippocampus, which did help alleviate the seizures, but you ended up with major loss of memory there. Then you have anterograde amnesia. This is the inability to store long-term memories. So again, you might have your memories from the past, but let's say you had a car accident or another kind of brain damage, for example. You might not be able to create new long-term memories because the transfer of short-term to long-term memories no longer functions. And it's also found the book talks about that even the memories right before the accident you might not remember because you didn't have time to transfer that from short-term to long-term memory. Okay. And then retrograde amnesia, again, is this loss of memory for events that occurred before the brain damage, which is just what I was talking about. Patients with damage to the hippocampus have great difficulties storing new long term declarative memories, again, especially episodic memories, although they form normal short term procedural and implicit memories, but that information can't be transferred into long term memory. Okay. They also find this when you have damage to the prefrontal cortex. So, for example, okay, let's say you had a stroke or a head trauma, for example. If you have damage to the prefrontal cortex, you might, again, have misplaced memories, or your memories might be a little bit confused. And the book starts talking about people that have this, and they ask questions like, how old are you? How old are your kids? How long have you been married? And the answer they have just are not logical and they don't make sense. But the person's memory, in their memory, they truly think that, like, even if they were married for 40 years, they might think in their mind they're only married for 4 months, and they really believe that. And this is because they had damage to the prefrontal cortex, which also affected their memories. So memory impairments and Alzheimer's disease. Again, Alzheimer's disease, this is a condition where you experience memory loss, confusion, depression, disordered thinking, impaired attention. There is some association between genetics and Alzheimer's, but they are seeing that a lot of it is actually cultural. A lot of it is because of the social context. And the book brought up the story about the isolated tribe, and even the people that have the genes for Alzheimer's, they don't actually ever get Alzheimer's. And so again, there is some epigenetic factors there that the social context influences your gene expression, for example. So it could be that Alzheimer's is associated with the cultural context, and that is then activating the Alzheimer's genes. Okay, but their problems largely stem from impairments of arousal and attention. And then early childhood amnesia is a really cool thing your book talks about. And this is the idea that, again, guys, think back. Do you actually remember anything before you were like 3? Okay. So what happened to all the memories before you were 3? Is it just that everything was kind of cloudy and your brain hadn't totally organized everything into schemas that make sense, that are categorized and coded in ways that you can actually understand in modern times now that you've learned language and a system of coding information, for example? So there's a lot of theories about why we don't remember. You have the Freudian psychosocial aspects, and then you also have the information processing. And so some really good stuff to think about there, but it's a great question is why? Why don't we remember these childhood memories? However, but many of us do remember a lot of things from 3 and on. So it's not like long-term memory doesn't work for children, but it could just be the way that it's coded. And then because of the way it was coded as a child, and they didn't have the skills of language to be able to, attach language and memories to specific memories, that they're just no longer accessible. So you could argue that our childhood memories are still there. It's just that we can't access them until we can come up with some kind of memory cue, some retrieval cue. But whatever retrieval cue we might have built in when we were 2 doesn't make sense in modern times because, again, it was a 2-year-old trying to do a very elaborate coding system. That'd be like giving a 2-year-old a library full of books and saying, okay, organize this information. And how well is a 2-year-old going to organize a library full of books? So again, that could, it's not that we don't have long-term memory as children. It's just that the idea of the coding might not match the coding system that we would use when we're older. Okay? So good luck on the chapter with memory. Some really good discussion questions in there and a quiz. If you guys have any questions, again, please let me know. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.